So once again, happy Friday, everybody. It's Friday, it's the Buddha Center, it's the temple. So let's get started like we normally do. Short period of bell meditation. So wherever you are behind your avatar, just get into a nice meditation posture. And as I ring the Ching bell, focus on the sound of the bell. Really get that deep listening going, get that concentration going, so we can all absorb some Dharma today. But you're going to get distracted, happens to all of us. When it does, I just want you to gently remind yourself and say, oh yeah, I'm supposed to be listening to the bell, and just go back to that. So give you a moment, get into a nice meditation posture wherever you might be behind your avatar, and we'll begin at the sound of the bell. I go for refuge to the Buddha, the teacher. I go for refuge to the Dharma, the teaching. I go for refuge to the Sangha, the taught. I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Dhamma. I take refuge in the Sangha. I have taken refuge in the Buddha. I have taken refuge in the Dhamma. I have taken refuge in the Sangha. 3 pure precepts. Cease to do harm. Do only good. Do good for others. Bodhisattva vow. However innumerable all beings are, I vow to lead them all. However inexhaustible my delusions are, I vow to extinguish them all. However immeasurable the Dharma teachings are, I vow to master them all. However endless the Buddha's way is, I vow to follow it completely. Swaha. All right, so if you read the notice, you saw the subject today is guilty. So we're going to talk about guilt. Excuse me. Now, in order for Buddhism to get firmly established in the West, we've got to make an effort to resolve particular psychological dispositions that are present in the body-minds of many of us Western practitioners, myself included. One disposition, and this one is not so present in the East, is one of guilt. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Because traditional Buddhism, because it's not prevalent in the East, traditional Buddhism doesn't spend a lot of effort on it. There's a little bit, but not a lot. So guilt is an inhibitor in Western societies. And given the cultural drive toward individuality, then expressions of guilt tend to be very self-centric. The idea like, oh, it's all my fault, right? That's very self-centric. That's saying, look at the power I have. I did this all by myself. Or it might even be, it's all their fault. Kind of the opposite, right? I didn't do anything. Right? It's that very individual look at guilt. Now, in Eastern societies like China or India, Tibet, Japan, for example, it's the disposition of shame over guilt, because that's the more society-centric focus, and it arises from a very deep connection that they have with their ancestors, for example. So, guilt. Guilt requires a really strong sense of individualism to be present, like it is with us, right? In Western societies, and we've talked about this earlier in the year about individualism. But shame, it requires a strong sense of family and community. So guilt, individual; shame, more community, more society-oriented. Traditional Buddhism deals more readily and more effectively with the potential pitfalls of shame, whereas it is lacking in addressing the issues that surround guilt. An example is found in the, let me see if I can butcher another sutta name here, the Ambalathika Rahulavada Sutta. Or, translated, Instructions to Rahula at Mango Stone. This is found in the Mahima Nikayas, in the Pali Nikayas. And this is a sutta where the Buddha is actually speaking directly to his son, Rahula. At this point, it was said to be 7 years old. And he's talking to him about the shame that should arise when one tells a deliberate lie. See the connection there? 7-year-old, deliberate lie. So I picture the dad sitting down with the son. Well, he ends the verses in which he does all his big explanation, that the Buddha likes to do, but he ends it with this verse. In the same way, Rahula, when anyone feels no shame in telling a deliberate lie, there is no evil, I tell you, he will not do. Thus, Rahula, you should train yourself. I will not tell a deliberate lie, even in jest. So that section of that particular sutta, that's what it ends with. Now, you could put a lot of different things in there instead of the word lie, and it would still be the same idea. But because the Judeo-Christian heritage focuses so heavily on guilt, and because this is incubated for centuries in the philosophical heritage of Westerners, it's in our philosophy, in our religion, in our politics, then guilt must be addressed honestly in order to develop an effective, unhindered, and wholehearted approach to Buddhist practice. If guilt isn't realized as a hindrance and remains in the body-minds of those who practice Buddhism in the West, it will hinder the progress of that practice. Guilt is very powerful. Or it can be if we let it. So we're going to look at two kinds of guilt. The first one is called essential guilt. Now, this is the guilt that is based on a misunderstanding of one's actual relationship with reality. It overemphasizes and it exaggerates one's involvement in outcomes. And it fails to acknowledge the broader causal nature of events. It's the idea, one person takes the blame. They did it all. They were the total cause of whatever happened. Now, essential guilt is both a cultural and societal derived concept of guilt. And this foundation is laid most often for all of us during our formative years. This is something you should be guilty about. This is something you don't have to be guilty about, that kind of thing. Sometimes, essential guilt arises as the result of an unwholesome consequence of an action, but it more often arises from an inappropriate view of the event or the situation. There is corrective element. There is a corrective element in essential guilt, there is no corrective element in essential guilt because of the fundamental misunderstanding of the way the causal universe works. So, for example, imagine you've missed a week of meditation practice. Now, that wouldn't happen. We know that, right? But you missed a week of meditation practice. And it happened for a variety of reasons. Well, it is the idea of essential guilt that can prevent a return to practice. Because it's so individually focused and you start putting yourself down, oh gosh, you missed a whole week, gee, why should we even go back to it? Oh man, we really blew this, we didn't keep it up. And you find yourself quitting. Essential guilt is not corrective since it is based on that fundamental misunderstanding of the way the world really is. And this is the kind of, this idea of guilt, it will literally hijack our best intentions. We want to do something, but we feel so guilty about it that we don't know what to do to fix it, or we can't figure out how to fix it. And when many Westerners attempt to start or develop a Buddhist practice, and yet miss a practice for various reasons, often it is essential guilt that prevents them from re-engaging that practice, like a meditation practice. However, though, good news, engaging in a second type of guilt allows the potential of returning to practice with an appropriate view of your own choices and actions. In contrast, if essential guilt is allowed to guide the body-mind, then no progress is made because there have been no ameliorative or restorative actions taken in order to assuage that guilt. So I think we've kind of come to the point here where Westerners, we've got guilt, it's something we have to deal with. Now, what we'd like to do is say, okay, let's get rid of guilt in its entirety. That's going to be really hard to do in the West. But what if we looked at guilt in a different way, as existential guilt? This is a corrective guilt. This arises when a practitioner is aware of and accepts that they have had direct involvement in an unfavorable outcome. None of this, it wasn't me stuff. Especially if it really was. There arises both awareness and acceptance, very important, and a genuine opportunity for corrective action because the guilt itself becomes a motivator to remedy or resolve the original disruptive, unwholesome action. And of course, the consequences of it. In order to engage a sense of existential guilt, there must be the awareness of the actual nature of the reality of causality and causal conditioning, which, by the way, is the subject for next week. For Monday, which is next week. So if we understand the causal nature of the universe and our interdependency with all phenomena, then we can approach situations with the knowledge and the experience that there are always multiple causal factors that lead to any outcome or action. Then we can get on and focus on corrective measures and enact them. Existential guilt allows us to find balance between intent and the causal factors that can be directly and wholesomely, or positively, if you will, affected. Feelings of essential guilt can make it seem like you have deep, unfixable flaws. And these arise solely because of that skewed perception. When we have essential guilt, we feel deeply flawed. But what is important here is to recognize that the feeling that we are deeply flawed arises because of that skewed perception, that inappropriate view, if you want to hit it with the Eightfold Path. When we think that we are a complete cause of something, and this is generally called linear causation, one cause, one effect, then we are the only factor to blame, right? We see ourselves as totally to blame. And our perception then becomes that we have to change our very being rather than let me try to fix whatever happened. No, it's like, I've done so bad and I am so guilty, I actually have to change me. Seems pretty drastic, not to mention dramatic. We fail to realize or recognize that in reality, there are a whole bunch of factors that allowed or even enticed us to make a certain decision, to make a certain choice. And we should instead focus on the factors that we can alter, that we can transform or change to prevent future choices of a similar kind. And if we don't look beyond the self, every time the self, or we, if you will, do something perceived to be less than perfect, we remember, reassert, and reinforce our perception that we are deeply flawed. And by the way, we're not that deeply flawed. As those of you who've been here for a while know, what I see in the people that I look at around, I see much more good than bad, much more wholesome than unwholesome, much more gem than flaw. But this can end up being an endless cycle that terminates only upon death. This whole beating yourself up with essential guilt. Essential guilt is a hindrance in the mind, and it clouds everything we do. Even doing things that have nothing to do with what you feel guilty about, the guilt still has its effect, if you let it. There is great hope in Buddhism, as we know, because the teachings of Buddhism ask us to see the nature of reality for what it is, causally conditioned. All things arise and pass away as a consequence, to varying degrees, due to their relationship with others, or other things, other phenomena. And while we are still responsible for our bad choices, we also recognize that we make those choices influenced by the totality of our conditioning. And this includes genetics and family and friends and culture, physical activity and work and training and worldview and a host of other stuff. The deeply empowering truth of Buddhism is that even when we make poor choices, we can take effective steps toward resolving them. We can make them better, and then beyond that, we can seek to make better choices in the next moment and any moments in the future. This is because knowing the actual nature of reality as causal, well, this allows us to address the factors that we are responsible for, transform them for the better, and importantly, accept the ones we can't change, which is another very important part of how we should engage with ourselves and the world. We must be ever mindful of our intent and the various influences that causally condition the choices we make. This allows us to be aware of what the causal factors are that affect our choices, and then to engage in the choices that lead us to a more wholesome personal character. We must maintain the awareness that no matter how bad a choice might have been, we will take responsibility for our role in it, while not forgetting that we are a part of that causal equation. In other words, we'll do our part, but others need to do their part too. I want to make clear, this is in no way, shape, or form a Buddhist license to abdicate responsibility. Again, we take responsibility for our part, and if our part was the biggest part, well, we take responsibility for that. That's that existential guilt. So you got choices. We like choices. You can go essential guilt, or you can go existential guilt. It can be all your fault. Some, maybe even a lot, your fault. But maybe not. Now, I didn't throw in this word, but I'm going to end with this. This takes a lot of rigorous self-honesty to look at what you are experiencing as essential guilt and saying, is this working for me? And then maybe look at things maybe that are more existential guilt. It's a good practice, but you got to be rigorously self-honest about what they are, because frankly, they can be kind of frightening. So as I said earlier, just to let you guys know, because this is so much about causality here, well, then the next thing we need to talk about in a little more depth is causality. So we'll talk about that on Monday in the Deer Park at 11 a.m. Second Lifetime. But for now,